happy family? David Andrews had always believed that true happiness was made of the small things: the scent of fresh coffee on a Sunday morning, the gentle patter of his son Ethan's feet down the staircase, and the easy laughter echoing from the kitchen where Sarah, his wife, would hum softly as she made breakfast. Their house, an unremarkable two-story on Oak Street, was nestled in a suburb that looked nearly identical to every other one in the city. A quiet place where the only drama unfolded on perfectly manicured lawns, and every family waved as they mowed the grass. On the surface, David's life was everything he had ever wanted. He was the provider, the sturdy presence in a home that seemed, at least from the outside, whole and content. Mornings began with Ethan's sleepy head resting on his shoulder and ended with Sarah pressed against his side, both reassuring and familiar. But beneath the routine, there was a tension in the air David couldn't ignore. It was subtle, a certain look in Sarah's eyes when she thought he wasn't watching, a tiredness in her voice that sleep alone didn't cure. Sometimes, late at night, he caught her staring out their bedroom window, lost in the glow of the street lamp. Her mind seemed far away. David worked hard at the insurance agency downtown, clocking hours that left him barely any energy by the time he returned home. Still, he tried his best, helping Ethan with homework, making time for date nights with Sarah even when he could barely keep his eyes open. The effort, he hoped, was enough to bridge any silent distance that might have crept in during the long years of marriage, during the struggle to simply keep everything together. They still had their moments, trips to the neighborhood park, movie nights with bowls of popcorn, Ethan giggling between them on the couch. Those were the times David clung to, certain that whatever unease he felt was just a phase, a difficult month, a stressful project, the ordinary fatigue that came with raising a young child and holding down a marriage in a world that never seemed to slow down. Yet, in the quiet moments after Ethan was asleep and Sarah retreated to her emails or scrolled through her phone, David wondered if he was missing something. He told himself every family went through dry spells, that love sometimes grew silent together, weathered stress and monotony, and he believed the foundation was solid. At least, he wanted to believe that. But then Sarah's phone began to buzz more frequently, the screen lighting up with messages she'd clear away too quickly. David wasn't the jealous type. He'd never been. But there was something different now. A subtle distance in her embrace, a distracted quality to her smile. When he'd ask about her day, she'd offer clipped answers, more interested in finishing her emails than finishing dinner with her family. One Thursday, David arrived home early, a rare treat. The house was unusually quiet, sunlight slanting through the living room windows, highlighting the dust motes and the silence. He called out, expecting Sarah and Ethan's voices, but got only the hum of the refrigerator in return. Upstairs, the door to the master bedroom was slightly ajar. Through the crack, he could see Sarah, sitting at her desk, speaking in a low, hurried tone on the phone. As soon as she noticed him, she startled and ended the call abruptly, slamming her laptop shut. "Hey, you're home already?" she asked, voice tinged with irritation rather than surprise. David hesitated. "Yeah, slow day. I thought I'd pick up dinner. Everything okay?" "Fine," Sarah said, too quickly. "Just finishing some work." He let it go. He always did. But that night he noticed she slept with her phone under her pillow, and she turned away from him in bed without a word. Over the following week, Sarah's absence became routine. There were spontaneous late meetings, new friends from work he'd never heard of, an evening spent locked in her car, talking on the phone before coming inside. Even Ethan noticed. "Mommy's working a lot, huh?" he asked one night, his small face pinched with worry. David lied and said it was just a grown-up thing. But the worst part wasn't the suspicion. It was the isolation. David found himself alone at the dinner table, staring at two empty chairs and growing deeply acquainted with the ache in his chest. He began to question himself, to replay old arguments and search for clues in Sarah's shifting moods. Maybe he hadn't tried hard enough. Maybe he wasn't enough. One Saturday afternoon, he came home from the hard threads of his marriage, hoping the strange colognes, late-night calls, and half-truths were figments of his anxious imagination. Maybe Sarah was just overworked. Maybe he was overreacting. But the evidence was stacking up, quietly, relentlessly. It started on a rainy Tuesday. David picked up Sarah's jacket from the back of a kitchen chair, feeling the familiar weight and softness. Her phone slipped out of the pocket and thudded to the ground. The screen lit up. A message preview hovered at the top. "Miss you already." The name was unfamiliar, a man's name. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen, heart pounding so loudly Ethan might hear it in the next room. But the phone's lock screen snapped shut, and the moment faded. All day, guilt gnawed at him. He had no right to pry. But he also couldn't pretend any longer. That night, as Sarah showered, he quietly checked her desk drawer. It wasn't locked. Inside, wedged between scraps of old receipts and business cards, he found a torn movie ticket stub and a photograph. Sarah, smiling, truly smiling, in the arms of a bearded man he didn't recognize. The backdrop was the downtown waterfront, a place she'd recently claimed to have visited alone for some quiet time. David's insides twisted. The betrayal was no longer hypothetical. It was real, undeniable, staring back at him in full color. The sickening sensation spread, icy and hot at the same time. He wanted to storm into the bathroom, demand answers, throw the photo down at her feet, but instead, he slid quietly to the floor, clinging to the edge of his son's bed, staring at a family photo on the wall. Ethan's laugh echoed from that distant day, unburdened, innocent. David realized, with sharp anguish, that whatever he did next would scar not just him and Sarah, but their son as well. That night, he watched Sarah with new eyes. Her affectionate gestures seemed hollow, her words rehearsed. At dinner, she smiled at Ethan and avoided David's gaze. He answered her questions mechanically, already playing out 100 conversations in his head, some angry, some defeated. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was fitful, full of fractured dreams and questions that spun out of control. By morning, David's resolve had shot through the silence. David looked up from the puzzle Ethan had abandoned on the coffee table, his heart heavy. He knew what was coming, but the finality in her tone still sent a jolt of dread down his spine. He nodded. Sarah laid the papers on the table between them. "I think it's time we get divorced," she said, not a quiver in her voice. "I've already met with a lawyer. These are the preliminary documents. You should find one for yourself." Her words hung in the air as David struggled to breathe. A dozen questions tried to push their way out, but none made it over the lump in his throat. He glanced at Ethan's half-finished puzzle. The smiling cartoon dog split into pieces, and something inside him froze. "Sarah, can't we talk about this?" he managed. She shook her head, lips pressed thin. "There's nothing to talk about, David. This isn't working anymore. I need to do what's best for me. And for Ethan." The hypocrisy stung. "Best for Ethan," he echoed. They both heard the edge in his voice. Sarah's eyes hardened. "I don't want to fight. This doesn't have to be ugly." But even as she said it, she glanced away. A flicker of guilt. Or maybe calculation. In the days that followed, the house lost whatever warmth it once held. Sarah became a ghostly presence, moving from room to room with mechanical efficiency. She told friends and her family, painting David with the broad brush of blame. Inattentive, distant, consumed by work, he heard the whispers. At Ethan's school, in the grocery store aisle, the subtle, pitying looks that lingered after he walked by. Sarah's parents arrived often, casting frosty glances his way, whispering conspiratorially with their daughter behind closed doors. Ethan sensed the shift, his laughter growing tentative, his cheeks tight with anxiety. When he clung to David's side, Sarah pulled him away, reminding her son that Daddy needs some space. Time lost all meaning in the endless negotiations that followed. The division of property, the gritted teeth conversations about custody, and the endless parade of paperwork. Evenings that once brought the comfort of family now arrived heavy with silences too loud to break. He was fighting alone. The legal maelstrom. Divorce, David learned quickly, was not just a wound, it was a battlefield. The paperwork was only the first volley. What followed was an endless parade of filings, court dates, emails from lawyers, and gut-churning meetings with strangers who now held the fate of his family in their hands. Sarah was unrecognizable from the woman he'd once known. She became strategic, guarded. Her once earnest conversations replaced with carefully worded statements crafted to be weaponized in court. Her attorney, a sharp-tongued woman named Claire Mason, wasted no time crafting a narrative. David as the absent husband, too absorbed by work to care for his wife or child, emotionally unavailable and unfit for custody. David hired his own counsel, a tired, overworked man whose suit always seemed 2 days away from the dry cleaners. He assured David they'd seen cases like this before, but every move Sarah and Claire made seemed to put him 2 steps behind. In mediation rooms lined with diplomas and motivational posters, phrases like "in the best interests of the child" and "equitable division" were repeated with clinical detachment. But the stakes couldn't feel colder or more personal. Sarah described incidents David hardly remembered, moments distorted until he barely recognized himself. He listened, speechless, as she accused him of hostility, of neglect, of minor aggressions that, when stacked together, painted him as a danger to his son's well-being. Even Ethan's bedtime stories became ammunition. One offhand comment a pretext for Sarah to question David's judgment as a father. If David objected, he was combative. If he stayed calm, he was detached. No answer was the right one. The hardest blow came with the temporary custody arrangement. Claire argued convincingly that Ethan's stability required a consistent routine, which, conveniently, meant Ethan would remain with Sarah in the house while David moved out. He was to have visitation twice a week, supervised at first. His own in his 1-bedroom apartment, listening to the city drone below. The walls crawled with doubts. He wondered if he could endure the endless cross-examination, not just from lawyers and judges, but from Sarah. From a world that seemed eager to believe the worst. Divorce, he realized, was not just the end of marriage, it was the systematic erasure of everything he thought he was. And the fight had only just begun. The battle for custody. David had never imagined that ordinary moments, sharing breakfast with his son, a Sunday stroll in the park, even helping Ethan solve a tricky math problem, could become so precious, so fiercely guarded. Each visit now ticked away like grains of sand in an hourglass, with the looming awareness that these windows together were scheduled, scrutinized, permitted only at the discretion of the court. In the early days, parenting time was supervised. He sat across from Ethan in the bright, over-furnished playroom at Family First Counseling, trying to seem cheerful for his son while a court-appointed observer sat nearby, scribbling notes. They were strangers in a world of plush toys and anxious parents. Still, Ethan would reach for David's hand, whispering, "I miss home, Daddy." The urge to scoop him up and just walk out the door was overwhelming, but David said what he'd been coached to say. "We'll always have time together, buddy. I promise." Outside those moments, David fought, on paper. His lawyer warned him that custody cases were no longer about right or wrong, but about perceptions. Every email, every text, every story Ethan shared would be weighed in the balance. Sarah's attorney painted him as absent and unstable, feeding the court cautious reports about David's emotional volatility, undermining his role even as a visitor in his child's life. Witnesses appeared, neighbors, teachers, even Sarah's parents, each offering fragments of truth, memories recast through the lens of divorce. Had David raised his voice? Was he late for school drop-offs? Had he forgotten Ethan's soccer match when work deadlines piled up? Each small failing became a stone the other side gleefully added to their growing pile. David had to submit to evaluations, psychological tests in stuffy offices, home visits from social workers. Impassive, eyes moving from Sarah to David as lawyers traded accusations and defenses. Sarah looked resolute, her arguments precise. David answered every question as carefully as possible, injecting each word with as much honesty as the law and his own battered heart would allow. At the end of the day, the judge promised a decision soon. David walked out into the autumn air, exhausted, hands trembling. Sarah hurried away without a word, surrounded by her parents. Ethan was back at the house they no longer shared. That night, alone in his apartment, David paced between boxes he still hadn't unpacked. He looked at the photo of Ethan on his nightstand, a gap-toothed smile from their last beach trip as a family, and made himself another promise. Whatever the outcome, he would not let his son slip away. He would keep fighting, no matter how hard, for whatever scraps of fatherhood the court allowed him. In the battle for custody, love and resolve would have to be enough. Lonely nights and new beginnings. The verdict came on a chilly Wednesday, sunlight struggling through the blinds and leaving sharp stripes across David's cluttered kitchen. He read the judge's ruling once, twice, 3 times: joint legal custody, primary residence with Sarah, visitation every other weekend, and Wednesday dinners. He slumped into a chair, the words heavy as stone, pressing down on his chest. That night, David made mac and cheese for one. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant city sounds. He tried turning on the TV, but every show grated, an unwelcome reminder of the family laughter that once filled his living room. Sometimes loneliness felt like a physical ache, tight and raw, magnified by the empty chair across the table. He got through the days by sheer force of will. He kept busy at work, though colleagues treated him with a new wariness, some sympathetic glances, others avoiding conversation altogether. On lunch breaks, he scrolled through old photos of Ethan, toddler grins, Lego towers, Halloween costumes, replaying memories that belonged to another life. He wondered if Ethan missed their old routines as much as he did. Wednesday nights and alternating weekends became islands of light in his calendar. He tried to make guitar for the first time in years, calluses blooming on his fingers while he worked through rusty chords. Slowly, life edged back in. He started talking more with colleagues, accepting invites for drinks after work. He reconnected with old friends. Some had drifted away with the divorce turmoil, but a few remained, steady and loyal. Sharing beers and rough jokes in crowded bars, he found pieces of himself he feared he'd lost. One rainy Saturday, David stopped into a corner bookstore to escape the drizzle. Browsing the aisles, he struck up a conversation with a woman named Grace. Warm smile, thoughtful eyes, laughter that didn't sound forced. She was a single parent too, and as they swapped stories about joint custody, school projects, and the secret relief of the occasional quiet night, David felt the tiniest spark of hope. He wasn't sure where things might go, or even if he was ready. But as they sipped coffee by the window, rain painting the city in soft blurs, he allowed himself, for the first time in months, to think about new beginnings. Loneliness had taught him survival, but hope beckoned him forward, clumsy and cautious, but hungry for more. And David, battered but unbroken, took his first steps into the life waiting on the far side of heartbreak. Healing and forward motion. Autumn deepened, and the world outside David's apartment softened into gold and rust. The crisp air, once a cruel reminder of how quickly life could cool and change, began to feel like a gentle nudge from the world to move forward, to open the windows, air out old worries, and let the present in. The wounds of the divorce were still there, tender but faded. Conversations with Sarah stayed concise and civil, about school projects, coughs, birthday invitations for Ethan's classmates. Some days, when David watched Sarah pick Ethan up at the curb, her new boyfriend's car waiting at the intersection, the hurt would spark fresh. But it no longer controlled him. The fury had burned out. What remained was a strange, low dates here, playground visits with their kids there. There were awkward missteps, lulls in conversation where shared pain surfaced. But these felt honest, unforced. They laughed about burnt dinners, mismatched socks, and the simple miracles of sleeping in every other weekend. Trust hadn't rebloomed overnight, but both recognized its gradual return. One evening, as autumn tipped toward winter, Ethan tugged at David's sleeve while they listened to music on the couch. "Are you happy, Dad?" he asked, his brown eyes wide and searching. David thought about it. The bruised years, the endless courtrooms, the loneliness. He looked at Ethan, at the nest they'd built out of fractured dreams and stubborn love. For the first time, the word came easily. "Yeah," he said, squeezing his son's hand. "I really am." The next morning, David woke before sunrise, the city outside wrapped in blue quiet. He made coffee, stood on the balcony, and watched the sky brighten. The future still felt uncertain, and some days were harder than others. But there was movement now, a sense of purpose and possibility. He could see his life beginning to mend. The past would always be there, but it no longer defined the road ahead. Healing, David realized, wasn't about forgetting. It was about building something new, imperfect but honest, fragile but real. And with every day, he took another step forward, grateful for the journey and hopeful for what might finally be waiting just around the corner. Father and son. Sundays became sacred. With a predictability that felt almost holy, David and Ethan would wake well after sunrise, padding around the apartment in their pajamas, trading sleepy grins and half-formed plans. Gone were the sharp-edged mornings of the divorce era. In their place bloomed a gentler ritual, two souls relearning how to fit together. Breakfast was always an adventure. Sometimes it meant elaborate, gooey French toast, other times just bowls of cereal eaten cross-legged on the floor while cartoons flashed on the screen. David found himself shaking off the old anxieties, the constant fear of not measuring up, of letting Ethan down. Last silences in between, the faint sighs after a tough day at school, the nervous foot-tapping before a big test, the quiet pride when Ethan held up a hard-won A on a spelling quiz. Gone was the distracted father, the one always just out of reach. In his place stood a man committed to being present, not perfect, but there. Gradually, Ethan began confiding in him more. He spoke about his dreams, crazy ones about flying cars and opening a dog hotel, and his worries. Would he make new friends at middle school? What if he missed Mom when he was with Dad, or Dad when he was with Mom? David listened, arms around his son, aching with gratitude that Ethan still trusted him with these tender truths. Not every moment was simple. Sometimes Ethan came to visits angry, sullen, confusion painted across his young face. Sometimes David's old fears, the tug of court orders, the tentative peace with Sarah, the haunted what-ifs, would surge back. But each new day offered another chance, another pancake breakfast, another walk beneath the city's changing sky. One chilly evening, as they stargazed from the fire escape, Ethan leaned against his father and whispered, "I'm glad you're my dad." The words, soft as breath, settled straight into David's heart. Tears pricked behind his eyes, but he only squeezed Ethan's shoulder and said, "Me too, kiddo. Always." Father and son. No court could define it, and no heartbreak could unseat it. In the measured cadence of these days, ordinary and extraordinary all at once, David knew he had found the meaning he'd been searching for, long before the world upended itself. And as city lights flickered to life below, he understood. This was family, rebuilt, and unbreakable in ways he never thought possible. Chapter 22. Spring crept in quietly, painting the city in soft greens and shy blossoms. The ice broke on the river, and sunlight slipped between the tall buildings, warming David's morning run along the park path. He noticed it in his chest, a lightness, something new, or maybe just long forgotten. Some days he felt 17 again, others every bit his age, darting between the living room and the kitchen, their shrieks echoing down the hall. Other nights, it was just the two of them sharing stories, grace notes of lives that had not gone as planned. One night, as they washed dishes, Grace turned to David and said, "It feels good, doesn't it? Just this." He smiled, not trusting himself to say aloud what his heart already knew. With Sarah, too, the edges had softened. There were hiccups, naturally, and tense phone calls about schedules or forgotten homework, but there was also a new civility, a mutual understanding born from exhaustion and, perhaps, gratitude. They'd weathered the storms. What remained was respect, and for Ethan's sake, a willingness to build something like friendship from the wreckage. One weekend afternoon, Ethan fidgeted with his telescope on the balcony, trying to focus on a stubborn crescent moon. "Dad, are you happy?" he asked, so direct it startled David. He hesitated, searching himself for the truth. He thought about all he'd lost, the marriage, the home, the old certainty. But he also thought about what he'd gained: honesty with himself, renewed ties with friends, the kind of clarity that only comes after you've been broken and built yourself anew. He looked at his son, bathed in the silvery glow of city light and moonshine. "Yes, buddy, I really am," he answered simply. And for the first time, the words rang true. Years later, people would ask about that time, about the divorce, the custody fight, the sleepless nights. David would shrug and say, "It was hard, but we made it out. We found each other again." He didn't dwell on the pain or the bitterness or the staggering weight of grief. because what endured, in the end, was the quiet happiness that comes from surviving, from making new memories, from choosing hope every day. There, in a small but sturdy apartment, father and son mapped their constellations about the future. David listened closely, hearing hope in Ethan's voice, where there once had been only confusion. School was going well for Ethan. He breezed through math and threw himself into science projects with messy abandon. At the spring concert, David watched from the third row, his heart thudding with pride, as Ethan bashfully plucked his violin. Afterward, Sarah waved from across the auditorium. They traded tired, genuine smiles, a silent truce that felt like a small miracle. Grace and David, too, had charted their uneasy middle space into something richer. There were weekends spent together as a makeshift family, picnics under cherry blossoms, movie nights with everyone fighting for the good popcorn. It wasn't always smooth. Sometimes the past barged in, bringing old fears or moments of awkward silence. But they learned to weather the bumps, to love each other's kids, to laugh at their own mistakes. Some evenings, when Ethan was with Sarah and the apartment felt just a little too quiet, David wandered the city. He would stop at the old corner bookstore or grab a late coffee with a friend. He walked the riverbank under the faint hush of distant traffic, content in his solitude. He was not the same man who had first moved here, afraid, angry, uncertain. Now there was space inside him for gratitude. One night, as the city outside shimmered with the hopefulness of early summer, Ethan crawled onto his father's bed, clutching an old stuffed bear. "Dad, do you ever wish things had stayed the same?" he asked, eyes wide and honest. David took a long breath, remembering how he used to dread that question. But now there was only a quiet acceptance. "Sometimes," he admitted, brushing Ethan's hair away from his eyes. "But if things hadn't changed, we wouldn't know how strong we are, or how much we belong together, no matter what." Ethan nodded, content with the answer, and drifted off to sleep. David watched his son's chest rise and fall, realizing how much he had learned from the boy beside him. Arrived with a shrug and a shimmering heat wave, turning the city sidewalks into rivers of molten gold. David and Ethan marked the end of another school year with the ritual they'd claimed as their own: late-night milkshakes at the corner diner, clinking their glasses together over sticky tabletops, planning imaginary road trips and wild adventures. A year ago, Ethan's hopes had been cautious, his laughter hesitant. Now he dreamed out loud, confidence returning, like the steady thrum of cicadas in July. The rhythm of their days felt earned, mornings layered with routine, brushing teeth to the same old song, toasting bread in tandem, arguing playfully over who got to pick the radio station. Ethan spent long afternoons with friends at the community pool, his world expanding outward. Every few days, David checked in with Sarah, the old tensions replaced by steady, even-handed co-parenting. They celebrated Ethan's small victories together, an improved report card, a new badge in Scouts, a sudden, inexplicable talent for magic tricks. David's own life, too, was blossoming. He took on a new project at work, something challenging and creative. Evenings, he found himself meeting friends for jazz on the park lawn, or running with Grace and Mason, their laughter floating beneath the streetlights. The fledgling nervousness of new love had settled into something quieter, warm, reliable, as sustaining as sunlight. There were, of course, reminders of old storms. Sometimes guilt pricked him, about the past, about the missing weekends, about being just a little too tired or distracted. Some nights, the city's buzz couldn't drown out the hush of loneliness, but by now, David had learned not to run from those feelings. He let them wash over him, then ebb away, leaving room for gratitude. One blue-skied Saturday, Ethan suggested they go camping. They drove out of the city, car packed to the brim, Ethan navigating in the passenger seat. The forest hummed with summer life. As they built a small fire, roasting marshmallows to sticky perfection under a canopy of stars, Ethan curled up beside his father. "Do you think things will always be like this?" he asked, a soft, impossibly hopeful question. David smiled, pulling the sleeping bag snug. "Things will change. Begin again." David watched the sun climb, gold over the evergreens. He pictured all the chapters yet unwritten, gray hairs and new homes, larger questions and deeper joys. For the first time, the future felt not just survivable, but bright, unspooling before them like a road waiting to be traveled. He turned, zipped the tent flap back, and smiled at the sound of Ethan's sleepy voice calling him home.